This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to Tao Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host. Here from the studio in Tel Aviv, it is my distinct pleasure to host a familiar name to all of us who deal with national security and Middle Eastern affairs, Dr. Dan Shueftan. Welcome to our studio.
Delighted to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you. I've known you for many, many years. You're always fascinating. You always have something interesting to say about the situation. Let me just, for the benefit of our viewers and our listeners, just say that Dr. Dan Shueftan has taught at University of Haifa, now is teaching also at Tel Aviv University. But I think that you have a record of decades of advising decision makers, lecturing all over the world. You wrote many books, and you are a very present voice in Israeli public discourse. And my first question to you is, what, in your view, is the main significance of what happened 10/7 and post 10/7, and what is it that we're not getting about it?
I'm delighted you brought it up because this is what we're missing. We're missing the overall picture, the broader picture. What is at stake at the moment is no less than the question if a civilized society can defend itself against barbarians. What we have here is a state, not perfect, but a democracy, an open society, attacked by barbarians who openly say that what they want is to kill every Jew, and not only to destroy the state of Israel, but to dominate the world in a way that would have been a catastrophe for free people all over the world. And they start with an act of barbarism, and then they embed themselves in the civilian population, and they assume, and unfortunately many people agree with me, that if you embed yourself in the civilian population, you have immunity. In other words, because civilized people don't want to kill your children, you're safe when you're trying to kill our children from within your children. And what we have in Gaza is the most fortified position ever in human history. Not only fortified by weapons and booby-trapped homes and what have you, not only fortified by tunnels, by an underground city in Gaza, but fortified by the New York Times, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by the French government, by American students, American lecturers in universities in the United States and in other places, who basically say, you can't fight against barbarians. Once the barbarians decided to kill you, you have to capitulate, because in the course of fighting a war, innocent people are being killed. So you must stop the war so it stops the killing. And these people are either so myopic or so stupid or so morally twisted that they don't understand that if you let the barbarians win, it's the end of civilization. Let me put it this way. If the progressives of today were dominant in the 1940s, we would live under Hitler and Stalin, or the likes of Hitler and Stalin, until today.
Now, let me ask you this, a very, very interesting question. So what do you think is the reason for their complacency? Let me be more specific. Do you think it has something to do with post-World War II plenitude, the emergence of wealth? People got comfortable. They lost the desire to fight for their own country. And we see that in research in the United States, in England. Young people are not interested in joining the army and fighting for their country.
This is a product of something more profound, I think. The question is, can there be too much of a good thing? Let me give you an example from a different field, and you will see the parallel. Nationalism is a good thing, right? Without nationalism, no democracy, no pluralism, because if you don't have the solidarity of a big group, you cannot be willing to make concessions and to let others have something at your expense, understanding that in the long run, it's even better for you. And the only large-scale solidarity that you have is national solidarity. So nationalism is good. What do you call too much nationalism? You call it chauvinism, fascism, Nazism. And what is the number one enemy of nationalism? Fascism. Because when people see that nationalism could lead to fascism, they assume that nationalism must lead to fascism, the slippery slope, and therefore they become anti-nationalist. And this is what happened to many Europeans until the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine changed it in a considerable way. But the number one enemy of nationalism is too much nationalism, fascism. Now, the number one enemy of liberalism is too much liberalism, called progressivism, because it distorts things by taking it too far. And even the best of things can be taken too far. Transparency is a good thing. You want your government to be transparent, up to a point. Beyond this point, you can never have a serious discussion about anything because people are not speaking to the subject, they're speaking to the protocol. And instead of doing what is good, they do what looks good, what sounds good. So too much transparency can be damaging. For instance, do you want your life basically to be transparent in terms of everyday things? Yes. Do you want transparency in your toilet? Do you want everything in your life to be transparent at the expense of privacy? No. Let's take what we've seen recently in the post-colonial era. Do you want to condemn colonialism? Yes. Was it a bad thing? Yes, understandable at the time, and you must understand it in the context of its time, like you must understand slavery in the context of the biblical era, for instance, but a bad thing that we should fight against. But then the assumption that anybody who's been under colonial rule must be just and pure, and we must support him even if he's a barbarian. And you can have barbarians who were under colonial rule. And there is a difference how people dealt with colonialism. If they make it an excuse to be barbarians, we must be barbarians because we had colonialism, or you cannot call us barbarians because we were under colonial rule, then you're going too far. Let me give you another example. I had a confrontation about that in a British university when I said that pluralism must have its limits. So they said to me, what do you mean? If you have limits on pluralism, then it's not pluralism anymore. I said, what about if pluralism is being used in order to destroy pluralism? Democracy must be a self-defending democracy, so that democracy is not used to bring down democracy. And they very strongly disagreed with me, and the only way to describe it to them was for me to say, you know what, let's all go for dinner. You want beef, you want chicken, you want vegetarian, you want halal, you want kosher, everything is fine. What about if a cannibal wants to join us? Would pluralism extend to a cannibal joining us for dinner? No. I want to know if I'm on the guest list or on the menu. So there is a limit to everything, and everything good comes from the middle of the political spectrum. And if you go from one extreme to another, and if you take liberalism so far that people realize that it doesn't defend them anymore against barbarians. Let me give you an example because it involved a confrontation that I had in Germany in 2015. I came to the top decision makers in Germany in 2015 and I said, you're crazy. What you're doing by bringing in 1 million or more Arabs and Afghans and Pakistanis, by the way, other Muslims would have been different if they came from India or from Indonesia. It's a different Islam there. But if you bring these kinds of people with their values, with their culture to Germany, you are creating a fascist party in Germany. CSU, CDU used to be as far right as you can go legitimately in Germany. What we have in Germany today, the AfD, was created by Angela Merkel because people who suffer need to have a safe haven, so let us open our gates without limits. Okay, there are billions of people who suffer in the world. If you open the gates of Europe, Europe will suffer like them. And if you allow people to come to Europe and to bring their culture with them, the culture that destroyed their own countries to begin with, the political culture that destroys their countries to begin with, then you're inevitably pushing people to the other pole.
Now, let me ask you a big picture question. So there's a fear among many of the people that I talk to that the success of Hamas on 10/7 triggered the appetite of radical Islam. They view Israel as weak. They see this as an opportune moment to strike and strike again. And an explosion, inflammation in the northern border is only a question of time. It's inevitable. We see that the Iranians were not hesitant to strike Israel with ballistic missiles and so on. Would you agree with that assessment that the radical Islamic world is looking at this as a moment where they can strike and perhaps even defeat Israel?
Let us go further than your question and focus on the Muslim Brothers. In the Gaza Strip, you had a practically sovereign state of the Muslim Brothers. They behaved in a barbaric way that the Palestinian people support, that the Palestinians in the West Bank support, that the Palestinian people in Gaza support. Okay? At least 70% when you take Khalil Shkaki's public opinion polls. If they can show that they can kill Jews, rape Jews, decapitate Jews, and get away with it, the first danger is in the Middle East. In other words, the Muslim Brothers can take over Egypt. If they take over Egypt, then you have a regional war again in the Middle East. If they take over Jordan, and they are very, very strong in Jordan. Jordan has a terrible public opinion, Palestinians and Muslim Brothers. So they could take over in Egypt, in Jordan, in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Bahrain. And then the Middle East will erupt into a major confrontation, not only between Israel and the Arab states, but also within the Arab states. And it'll be a calamity. So allowing them to win by whatever excuse you have, and you use human rights for it. Again, human rights became the weapon of the barbarians against civilized people. Not because there's anything wrong about human rights, but because it was prostituted. And what we have is a global process of prostituting the values of civilized society. For instance, if you have an organization like the United Nations, where you have one country, one voice, but the majority of countries are not one person, one voice. In other words, the majority of the United Nations are countries that are either autocratic, theocratic, barbaric, or what have you. Some of them, the filth of the earth. Speaking of the regimes in these countries, North Korea, to give only one example, or Syria, or what have you, and they are the majority. Countries that are not democratic, not pluralistic, are the majority. And the Europeans want to sound good, and they invented something called the international community, which basically comes down to the United Nations. And every international organization is prostituted by the fact that the majority of participants are countries who are not democratic, not pluralistic, not open societies, and they determine what is considered legal, democratic, open-minded. This needs to stop. And you know what? It went so far now with the decision of the court in The Hague that maybe we are at the beginning of the end of this terrible period where the progressives have prostituted liberalism by taking it too far.
So you foresee a pushback?
I foresee a pushback. You know what? I foresaw 3 pushbacks in Europe after 2015. First of all, unfortunately, a counterproductive for liberals who wanted to do it from speaking about liberal values, and then they created the fascists, and they pushed European public opinion to the right, and very often too far to the right, okay? Look at what is happening with fascist parties all over Europe. Now, if parties who used to be fascist are now not exactly to my liking, but no longer fascist, okay, you can live with it. But what you need is to bring the consensus into the middle of the political spectrum. Again, we need to go beyond the Middle East. I'm afraid of Western societies becoming polarized like the American society. I recently spoke to friends of mine in the American Congress, and I told them, I suggest the United States adopt a 2-state solution, a democratic state and a Republican state, because you don't speak to each other anymore. Because some people become cuckoo on the Trump side, and the others become cuckoo on the progressive side, and you no longer can reach the kind of compromises that democracy and pluralism are built on.
Now, there's an argument to be made that the same thing is happening in Israel, that the polarization of Israeli, and I agree with your assessment that the good things always come from the center. But there was the famous report put together by the former economic advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Eugene Kendall, in which he talks about the division between the tribes cannot be fixed because they're not talking to each other. There is no dialogue. What do you think? First of all, I understand you disagree. I would be delighted to hear.
Very strongly disagree.
And what do you think we can do at this point to alleviate that pain?
Look, we have in Israel 3 societies. I think that what the former president said about the tribes in Israel is complete nonsense. But we have 3 societies in Israel. We have Arabs, we have ultra-Orthodox, and we have Israelis. Okay? The people who made Israel, built Israel, defend Israel, everything good about Israel are those who are not Arabs or ultra-Orthodox. Now, do you have individual Arabs and individual ultra-Orthodox who support this? Yes. They're my kind of people, okay? My solidarity extends to them. But the hardcore of the Haredi society are a danger to the existence of the Jewish people. The Arab parties and the fact that Arab elites are drawn into the Palestinian political culture, which is destructive, is a major problem. Again, individual Arabs, I have no problem, including Mansour Abbas. No problem with him whatsoever. But if you look at the political hardcore of the Arab society in Israel, unfortunately, and certainly the calamity of the ultra-Orthodox society, these are societies that are separate from the others. I don't think there is a major polarity between right and left in Israel. I don't think they disagree about anything important. We can establish, and we should establish in Israel, a government that can stretch from Meretz to Likud, okay, without Ben Gvir and Smotrich, without the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab parties. Again, individual Arabs, individual people from ultra-Orthodox who serve in the army and work. I have no problem with them whatsoever, but I'm speaking about the hardcore in both cases. Look at the overall issues that Israelis deal with. I don't think there is a major disagreement. For instance, we have no socialists in Israel. Thank God. I mean, we had it in the very distant past, and we know what it leads to. So, is it a mainstream in Israeli society? No. Is radical capitalism a major feature in Israeli society? No. The socio-economic disagreement is taking the welfare society a bit to the right, a bit to the left. Do we all know who our friends are, who our enemies are? That our number one enemy is Iran, that there is nothing productive you can do with the Palestinians. Practically everybody understands that there is a deep flaw in the Palestinian people. We may discuss it in a moment. But
before we get that, where would you put the question of what kind of democracy Israel should be on this?
I don't think there is a problem with the Israeli democracy. Let me put it this way. I don't know of a more stable democracy than the Israeli democracy. What we had here in the beginning of 23 was more copywriting about what will happen. Dictatorship is bullshit. Now, what we had here is a judicial elite who, because they crave power, not because of right and left, they wanted to be omnipotent, okay? So they very carefully taken us too far in one direction, and then came this government, the worst we've had, and has taken it far too far in the opposite direction. But what Bougie Herzog, what the president proposed, is a very good basis for compromise that everybody can agree on. If you want, later we can take it one bit by another and show the Israeli society is not polarizing. The people in Kaplan that are basically the people who protested in Balfour, they're basically the same kind of people. They have great copywriters with great slogans that you shouldn't take seriously, and you shouldn't listen to them because they're the radicals on the one hand. I have enough with the radicals of another. I'm delighted that the Israeli society is not polarizing. Now, how do I know that? The electorate of the Likud made Likud lose in public opinion polls half its power. And they went to the parking place called Benny Gantz. Okay? And what were they saying? They were saying to Likud, we're basically with you, not with Meretz, but with you. But we don't want Smotrich and we don't want Ben Gvir, and we don't want to capitulate to the Haredim. So we want to come back to Likud, but make it possible for us to come back to Likud. I think this is tremendously important. The understanding that the overwhelming majority of the Israelis are in the middle of the political spectrum, unlike what you have in America. In America, families are splitting because Democrats and Republicans can't.
Now, what you're saying is that, okay, there's a broad consensus in Israel about the nature of the threat that we're facing. And you started talking about Islamic Brothers and now Iran.
Iran is a major danger to the world order. This is a bunch of barbarians. And the problem is, like in Germany in the 1930s, when you have a very capable people with a barbaric leadership, when you have a people that in the long run can be our best ally, with a civilization that we can respect, but it's been taken over since 1979 by barbarians. For instance, there has never been in world history a country that had a terrorist infrastructure that is global. There isn't a place on earth where you don't have an Iranian terrorist infrastructure. These guys tried to kill the Saudi ambassador in Georgetown, in Washington, okay? Wherever you go, They are barbarian. There are terrorists who are ruled by barbarians. Whatever is good for Iran is bad for civilized humanity. Okay? And they not only want to control the Middle East, they can control the Middle East because they're so capable and so strong, and the Arabs are so weak. Now, here is the interesting paradox. Why is the situation of Israel in the Middle East better than ever before? We need to look beyond the condemnations that Arab regimes have to make vis-à-vis Israel and to see what's going on. What we wanted in our rosiest dreams was that the Arabs will acquiesce with our existence. Now we are in a far better situation. The Arabs need us. They can't do without us. And let me try to explain this. The Muslim Brotherhood is the immediate danger to most Arab states because it speaks to primitive people who failed, and their only way is to go back to what they know because they prove to be incapable of dealing with the modern world, with the 19th century world, not with the 21st century world. They're incapable of dealing with the 20th century, let alone with the 21st century. So they go to the very cozy place that the Muslim Brotherhood is offering to them. And the Muslim Brotherhood, like Shas, has the ability to pretend to be like us and to pretend to be pragmatic, but to be unbelievably dangerous. So they need, vis-à-vis Iran, vis-à-vis the radicals, vis-à-vis the Muslim Brothers, they need somebody they can trust. Is America immeasurably more important than Israel? Yes. Is Israel immeasurably more trustworthy than America? Yes. You can't trust the Americans. Because one day they may get somebody like Obama. By the way, a very nice person, a person I would love to have as a friend, as a neighbor, as a member of the PTA up to the 6th grade. Otherwise, it's a bit more complicated. But the worst president the United States had in world affairs, a person who wanted America to be weak, a person who wanted to capitulate, the appeaser of the modern era, the person who supported all the enemies of the United States and undermined the allies of the United States. And the Arabs say, we can't trust the Americans. Now, Biden is not half as bad as Obama, but he also has this streak in him. For instance, he brings down the Houthis from the terrorist list because he wants to give them humanitarian aid, because he's stupid enough to believe that if you give a radical humanitarian aid, he becomes less of a radical. He's a radical because he wants to kill you. This is what he's about. It's cultural. It has nothing whatsoever to do with humanitarian help. So he undermines the Saudi war against the Houthis. He takes them off the terrorist list. And of course, what the Houthis do is they shoot missiles against American vessels, because this is when you're stupid. This is what happens. This is like Kennedy was stupid and Eisenhower was stupid vis-a-vis Nasser. And Nasser realized, you're anti-American, America supports you. It makes sense to be anti-American because America supports you. So
let's go back to the principle that they need us. Yeah.
The Arab states need us because we're the only ones that are at the same time strong enough and determined enough. And we don't listen to the Americans. You can trust us because we don't listen to the Americans when they, for instance, Obama supports practically, not that it was his intention, but practically helps to undermine Mubarak and support the Muslim Brotherhood. So you can trust Israel. And here is the interesting thing that the Saudi-American-Israeli issue is now bringing up. America needs to leave the Middle East and pivot to Asia, because this is where the challenge for America is. If you want to leave the Middle East, you can't leave the Middle East. It's too dangerous unless you leave it to somebody. Who can you leave it to? only to a combination of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. If you undermine, like Obama did, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Israel, and you help Iran, you're being counterproductive in the global sense of American foreign policy.
By the way, he also invested a lot of energy in Turkey.
Yes, because Erdogan is the moderate Islam. Okay? If you don't understand the Muslim Brotherhood is much more dangerous because it can pretend to be civilized. And Erdogan pretended for almost a decade to be civilized, but he's a Muslim brother. Okay? And no wonder he supports Iran and Hamas. And he's a member of NATO. And he works with the Russians and buys their S-400. So when you're dumb, like so many American policymakers are, in misunderstanding radicalism, in assuming that in every Saddam Hussein there is a little Thomas Jefferson trying to come out, only he had a difficult childhood and we must give him humanitarian aid. Okay? This is how they think, and they profoundly misunderstand practically everything when it comes to radicals. Now, on the other hand, all of us would not be free without the United States. I mean, were it not for the American willingness to fight for freedom, all of us would not be free. I have tremendous respect for the United States and complete misunderstanding of how stupid Americans can consistently be when it comes to dealing with radicals. So now the Americans need us to be with the Arabs so that the Americans can leave the Middle East. So with all the difficulties that we are having now with the United States and with Saudi Arabia and with Jordan and all the statesmen and Egypt joining South Africa in claiming that Israel is perpetuating genocide in the Gaza Strip or something, go beyond it and see that the Egyptians, the Saudis and the Americans can't do without a strong Israel.
Now, our time is running out, and as much as I would have liked to continue this, let me conclude with one very important question that I'm sure our viewers and our listeners would like to hear from you. If you had to advise the Israeli decision makers now, what would be your top 2 or 3 points for them to consider?
Look, something that saves a lot of marriages is the ability to fake it. And I'm willing to fake it. So when the Americans, in a dumb way, come to Israel and say, we want to go on a path that will inevitably lead to an independent Palestinian state, Israelis know that Israel cannot survive with a Palestinian independent state because the Palestinians will bring Iran to Tulkarem and to Kalkilia. Okay? And I'm politically committed for decades to leave even unilaterally the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the overwhelming majority of the West Bank and all the Gaza Strip. So I don't want to stay there, and I very much want to disengage from both of it. But anybody who will give the Palestinians, as they stand today, an independent state will bring catastrophe to the Middle East. And it will not happen. And after October 7th, Israelis have sobered up, even the dumb Israelis who believe that if you're nice to the Palestinians, then you can really reach a historic compromise. The Palestinians will not reach a historic compromise as they are today. Now, the Americans come to Israel and say, you can negotiate with a reformed Palestinian authority that is not corrupt, does not support terrorism, and does not pay for terrorists. And we, instead of saying we don't want them, we should say, when you find such a Palestinian authority, bring them. We will negotiate with them and so on.
You're suggesting
fake it.
To do what Shamir did in Madrid.
Yes, fake it, okay? Say what is obviously needed, namely that the Palestinians will change their political culture from one extreme to another, okay? It will not happen. I would be delighted if it would happen. I would be delighted to get out of these territories if we had somebody we could talk to. We can't. The Palestinians have learned, and now the Americans are teaching them again, you only need to be barbaric and then we will mobilize ourselves to help you. Kill Jews and we will be and support killing Jews and finance terrorists, and then we will give you humanitarian aid and billions of dollars, and we will try to force you on Israel. Truman started with telling Ben-Gurion he has to accept the 1948 refugees. Then Kennedy did the same. The Americans were always completely off the mark, with one exception, by the way. The brilliance of Kissinger and Nixon in the 1970s helped in a major way the peace between Israel and Egypt. Not Jimmy Carter, and Begin had little to do with it. It was Nixon and Kissinger, the brilliance of Kissinger in the 1970s. This was the exception where the Americans made a major contribution to changing the Middle East in a favorable way. So my advice would be, vis-a-vis the Americans, A, so that you get them off our back. B, because we need a Palestinian component in the Gaza Strip, because we don't want to be responsible for their welfare. So I don't want Americans or pro-Israelis to be in the Gaza Strip, because otherwise we will not be able to kill Hamas when, not if, it comes up again. We must constantly, and this is something that we should have known before, but we have at least learned now after October 7th, if they have the capability to fight with us, they will. So you don't wait. This Israeli terrible thing, sheket yaneh b'sheket, tranquility or quiet will be responded by quiet. If they're quiet, they're about to kill you. If they haven't attacked you today, it is because they want to attack you tomorrow. So if they have missiles, you have to destroy them because they have it. If they're about to manufacture them, destroy the infrastructure that can manufacture these rockets. So we will have to go into Gaza for a long time. Every time they build something, we must go in, destroy it, and kill the people who do it. So I don't want Americans there to stand in my way. I don't want Emiratis there to stand in my way. I want somebody that I can disregard, as I disregard the Palestinian Authority when I come to Nablus or to Tulkarem or to Jenin or Kalkilia. So if we could have agreed with the Palestinians that they will deal with terrorism, this would be great. But the moment there is a challenge, they're impotent. They will do nothing to prevent terrorism. They never did. They never will. When it becomes serious, they're afraid of their own people, because they educate their own people that the only role model of a Palestinian is a terrorist. And this has not changed for 100 years. And their unwillingness, and anybody who says something else is either ignorant or a liar. They have never given up the right of return. They have never given up the destruction of the State of Israel. And I would be delighted even to partition Jerusalem. There are certain portions of Jerusalem I will be delighted to get out of. Beit Hanina, Shawafat, Tachet el-Barid, Jabal Mukabbar. You can get out of. You can reach, if you would have had a Palestinian partner, for compromise, a compromise is possible. But there never was one, there isn't one, and they're educating their own people so that there will never be one. So my advice would be, continue the war to the destruction of Hamas, but Gaza remains Hamas, and the West Bank is potentially Hamas. The only thing that prevents the West Bank from being controlled by Hamas is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So you should know there is no solution with the Palestinians. If you're looking for solutions, go for crossword puzzles.
Well, and on this note, I'd like to end our discussion because you covered so many subjects, and I'm really grateful that you came and took the time to sit here and share your views. And I'm reminded everything you talked about, either when you analyzed the miscalculations of the Americans over the years in the Middle East, all the way to why we haven't really dealt never with moderate Palestinians that accepted truly our right to exist. It brings to memory the famous saying by management guru Peter Drucker that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. At the end of the day, it's about understanding the local culture, and it seems like you have a good grasp of the local culture of the Arabs and the Palestinians in our region. I'd like to thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll have another session with you in the near future when things
Since
develop.
there won't be any solutions, we will have another session.
All right. And thank you for being so candid. And to our viewers and listeners back home from Tel Aviv, goodbye until our next episode.